All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are All podcast. And you know what, Brian? I've been thinking, right? As always, we live in, I would argue, the best time in American politics, the best time really in world culture, if you think about it. Would you agree with that, Brian?
Oh, yeah. Well, specifically, it's the best time for our country. That's America. I think everything's going good here. And I think that because it's so good here, it makes everything better geopolitically. Things are good in Europe. Things are good in East Asia. Really, you're seeing everything bubble up. You're seeing everything, all of the kind of prosperity, all of the brotherhood, the fellowship of the last 35 years or so have all sort of coalesced and they're kind of just rising up like the creamy goodness coming up, a froth of a beer. It's really all of the pleasures, all of the benefits really coming to a head, and you're seeing that in the 2020s. I love it.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that really reminds me of somebody who's really trying to just destroy this sort of Pax world, if you think about it, is somebody by the name of Roger Waters. He's such a fucking cuckold. Do you know about that guy, Brian?
So he was in the Beatles. He's an anti-Semite. He likes Hitler. He's a big Putin guy. He loves Putin. He's always singing about he wrote that "Give Peace a Chance." Everybody talking about thisism, that ism. Basically, like this cucked boomer who hates prosperity, hates wellness, and basically just is looking down on us from his ivory tower, saying, "I wish they were all doing bad. I wish everything was worse."
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So I think for this week's episode, we need to focus on this anti-peace, anti-American, anti-Western fucking scumbag.
We should all remember what John Lydon, who is very cool and has held up really well, said. He said, "I hate Pink Floyd." And he was coming from a very sincere, very well-informed place with a sincere interest in geopolitics. And he warned us all. He warned us that Roger Waters was a fascist and an anti-Semite and a zealot. And we didn't listen. And look now, look at Roger Waters now and look at John Lydon now.
Absolutely. So without further ado, let's talk about fucking Roger Waters. But before we get into it, Brian, let's bring back our segment. Cringe Generational Cringe Millennial Moment of the Week.
Cringe, cringe, cringe. Is our subject today cringe? Are they cringed or are they really cool and multimedia oriented?
I would say, Brian, they are extremely cringe. Very much so. And you had the suggestion to talk about this person like maybe a couple hours before we recorded. But Brian, I will let you do the honors.
Yeah, I want to talk about ContraPoints. For full disclosure, I mean, I've been aware of for several years now. I've never seen their content. Like, I've never seen a ContraPoints video. What I know is I think they were kind of the masthead in the like late 2010s and especially in the early 2020s, our current decade. Kind of like if there was a leader of BreadTube, this kind of nascent, identity-driven, superficially leftist, but mostly kind of liberal-oriented politics on YouTube. She was kind of like the bleeding edge of it, right? She's kind of like the definitive person for the BreadTube thing, as I understand. And I kind of just, to be honest, avoided her. I like some of those YouTube leftists. Like, I find some of their videos, like, kind of funny. There's this guy, FD Signifier, and he does stuff that I have historically enjoyed about, like, pop culture. Politically, it's not really my thing. If I'm looking for infotainment, I'm going to go more towards, like, your quote-unquote dirtbag left stuff. And, like, realistically, if I want to, like, learn about a subject, I'm going to sound like an asshole here. I'm probably just going to read, like, a book about it. I'll find, like, a historical book or a book theory book, and I'll read about something that way if I really want to learn about it. But I always, until pretty recently, I thought, oh, she's probably cool. She's ostensibly, I assume, some sort of, social democrat. She is a trans woman. That's not really relevant for a conversation, but I was like, oh, she probably has some insight. There's probably a reason she speaks to a lot of people. And I was sort of tangentially aware that she was not someone I would care to watch because she's kind of theater kid, kind of goofy costumes, kind of like I told you so snark humor, which is big for millennials, right? And up until, I guess, 6 months ago, 5 months ago, I kind of just didn't care about her. She's probably a nice enough person, but I'm not going to watch her content. And then she made a really weird series of takes. Taylor, I'm going to hand it off to you there.
Yes. So recently, she was on the Bad Faith podcast with Brianna Joy Gray, a lovely creator on the internet. I mean, Brianna Joy Gray over the years has, I would argue, generally had pretty good takes and opinions, but she's also made many, many errors over the years, just being honest, like employing.
I think that happens when you're taking an active role in activism in politics. I think that's pretty fair.
I was talking more about employing Virgil Texas, just being honest about that one. But like, and in general, she's really, and obviously she's not the main person that did this, but she very much is the type of person person who's like one of those like sports fans who's always like, they should be doing this, they should be doing that. It's like, Brianna, you're not part of the team. I don't know why you think this is going to happen.
They're never going to accept you.
And yes, objectively, she's correct. They should be doing that. But it's like, once again, a sports fan yelling at professional athletes on a TV. It's like, they're not going to do something just because you want them to.
I would say that giving the Democratic Party good advice might actually be long-term bad for making them progress at all. Well, they're never going to take her advice anyway, so it doesn't matter. At your kind of best, I revisited Bad Faith, and she does seem to have pivoted in some ways kind of towards other places, towards like more coalition building outside of the party and things, which I was pretty impressed with.
No, absolutely. I totally respect her, and I totally respect that she has, just that determination to continue on everything, even with people yelling at her. I do respect that. And, she does typically, maybe not typically, but a good amount of the time own the people that she's like debating with. And one of those people very recently was Natalie Wynn, otherwise known as ContraPoints, where she was on, I think it was a 3-hour debate /stream/discussion, which like,
I don't think it was supposed to be a debate. I think it was supposed to just be kind of a discussion because of Wynn's recent, I don't even think it's her pivots, because I think this is always basically what her politics have been, because of her recent she's kind of like come out, so to speak, as an anti-left liberal, in my opinion.
I mean, I would argue in like, not quite Destiny level fascism, obviously, but she's basically become like a fucking liberal nihilist in a lot of ways.
Yeah, she's like Blue Mega. She is a moral relativism, Western-oriented, American exceptionalism liberal. And to be honest, because I like to always feel like my intuition is so great, I'm inclined to be like, oh, that's probably why I never cared about her content and wasn't impressed when I saw her. That's probably not true, but there's a part of me that feels that way. The real tipping point, right, was her takes Palestine, right?
I think it was maybe even like in 2024, to be honest with you. Like, it's been quite a while she's been going on
this. A year now. You're right.
And yeah, I mean, her takes on Palestine are awful. Just like, and obviously we're not talking about like she's just like a straight up Zionist, because I wouldn't quite go that far, but like her feelings basically being like, it doesn't matter what we do, they're just going to do it anyways, so why focus on it, is such a nihilist answer to like atrocity.
It's such an American liberal answer. It's a non-answer that says there's nothing I can do about it, and also ultimately it won't affect me.
Not only that, but it's also like she comes at it from like the Blue MAGA perspective, where it's just like, haha, don't you feel so bad now that you decided not to vote for Kamala? The same shit would have happened regardless. And I know that also sounds like a nihilist answer, but that's just a realistic answer in this specific instance.
No, that is the truth.
Yeah, the absolute fucking truth. Like, Kamala was no fucking saint. She was obviously second in command of the administration that started this current fucking genocide.
And I think for me,
real quick, Brian, it's the same thing when people are like, oh, Trump was so bad during COVID, blah, blah. But it's like, more people died under Biden with COVID than did Trump. And the same thing with the Gaza genocide. I mean, let's be very clear here. Like, and we're not saying that like as you got owned because of numbers, but it really is just like, they're not going to save you just because one has a blue shirt and the other has a red shirt. It doesn't fucking matter. Like, they're both on the same side.
It is not in the interest of any of these people, who again are both political parties that represent the wealthy class, the richest class of people. It is in their interest to have what is happening in Gaza continue to happen, or at least to not abate it. And it's in their interest long term to do as little about COVID as possible. The thing with Natalie Wynn that's ContraPoints that really makes her a good cringe millennial subject, I think, is how stereotypically millennial she is in her content, as I understand it, in her lines of reasoning, and just in her general demeanor, which is this real kind of like this mix between snark and sad sack. I don't think could have been popular with any other generational kind of demographic, right? It's a very specific millennial thing. This mix of like sad, whiny, everything's so hard for me, and also the snark of like, oh, I've got everything figured out, and my response to everything is to have some like pithy 2-word answer that doesn't engage with the substance of whatever you've said.
No, absolutely. Yeah, it's very much of a millennial, little bit of Gen Z, obviously, a little bit. They have a little bit of that snark, although millennials are definitely the kings of fucking snark. But
I think with millennials, it's more self-righteous than with Gen Z, typically, in my experience.
Yes. Oh my God. Because like when, Zoomers do that, it's typically more about like ironic detachment. Whereas like millennials, they feel like they're actually like really speaking kind of the base lib thing once again. They feel like they're speaking truth to power because they made a snarky video essay that got 1 million views or whatever.
When what they are actually doing, I mean, I guess speaking truth to power is a nice way to put it. A more accurate way to describe what they do is they bear witness to the suffering of others.
No, absolutely. It's like when she's like, leftists only want to critique power and not, wield it. And it's like, no, that's what you do.
The frustrating thing with that line of reasoning with liberals is that liberals actively don't want to wield power. Like, if you talk to like a dedicated liberal who's basically a good person but votes blue because they genuinely believe in it, because I've had this conversation, I've said, aren't you worried that Democrats don't ever wield like authority when they have it? They don't actually push things through the way Republicans do. And they'll say, as instead of it's a positive, I think it's good that Democrats don't want power because they have this weird kind of, not even purity, they have this, well, they shouldn't want to wield power because everything is relative, and it's this, like, no, it is the strategy, like the active strategy of the DNC to not strive for power, to not struggle for it, and to not do anything with it when they have it, because that creates an expectation that they could do things.
No, it is genuinely like crazy. Like if people actually believe that liberals want to wield power, then they would certainly try a little fucking harder. They would try a
and why
little
don't they do
harder.
anything when they have it?
No, absolutely. It's always the adage that when good things happen, Democrats are nowhere to be found, but when it's to do a fucking bad thing, they're just willing to be all bipartisan about it.
They're like, oh, we have to do this, we have to capitulate. The thing that I guess the reason I wanted to do this, because we've talked about ContraPoints between ourselves, but for this episode is because I've always been resistant, despite the name of our podcast, I've always been pretty resistant to this kind of very self-satisfied generational like bickering. And I think you actually saw it a lot from the generation that Taylor and I are part of. You saw a lot of the boomers did this, Gen Xers did that. It kind of like cuts up history into these nice digestible things and kind of creates, not to be like your classic class reductionist guy, it creates this kind of invisible division that's pretty meaningless. And one of the things I think that's most frustrating about it to me is all of the criticisms that my peers have leveled at baby boomers and still have to do, they themselves have become just as guilty of in a third of the time without anything to show for it. Like there's no strong, potent, radical movement that happened with a large base of millennials the way there was for baby boomers. And you can look at the baby boomer like radical movements and you can say it's a missed opportunity, it was well managed. That doesn't even exist for my generation.
So absolutely fucking not. It's one of those things where like boomers existed and they always talk about like, well, we bought a house for whatever and it was 20% interest. But it's like, yeah, but you bought a house for a bag of chips. We don't have that anymore. Like, yeah, our interest rates for our houses are only quote unquote 6 to 7%. Average house is $500,000 if you're lucky in a lot of metros in America.
Yeah, it's completely changed. The whole idea of like a middle class has changed. Where like a middle class to our parents would have been someone with a house, with a car, probably with 2 cars, with all these amenities to it, right? And with a full-time job that was probably a union job or it was like managerial job. Either way, it had benefits. Whereas like I think to my peers, and this is me being genuine, I think, Taylor, that we are like the middle class of our peers for a great deal of them. Like I'd say you and I personally.
I would absolutely agree with that. Because like, we both live alone in our apartments. And I remember, I think I might have told you this off air, but I don't remember, but only about 10% of like people our age of like the quote unquote like millennial demographic actually live alone. 10%. That number for boomers was probably close to half if I were to hazard a guess. If the ones who weren't married, I mean, or had like kids or whatever the fuck. You know what I'm saying? Like you could afford to live alone if you worked part-time at McDonald's 30, 40 years ago. Like you just could. That's just the reality. You could get a fucking shitty apartment if you made $4 an hour, but you can't do that anymore. Even on the actual minimum wage, which in most states, unfortunately not Wisconsin, but many states is well above $7.25, but you still couldn't afford to live in the fucking studio by yourself.
Yeah, no. And I guess the thing that brings this back to Natalie for this episode is, so someone like Natalie Wynn has A, the resources, and B, has every reason as a representative of her class and her generation to become more radicalized by 2016 and 2020, which a lot of people...
Well, also just part of her demographic as like a minority person, to be very clear.
Yeah, exactly. She has every reason and every ability to push harder for progress. But for whatever reason, even with all of these kind of generational millennial signifiers, she doesn't want to. And it probably will cost her legitimacy and a large chunk of her fan base and a large chunk of people that respected her. A thing that I've been kind of enamored with lately is these kind of baby boomer era artists and singer-songwriters. We've talked about Tom Laughlin before. These people who reflect a fairly radical political line within the baby boomers, while being so like archetypically baby boomer, and who held that throughout their lives. Like with Tom Laughlin, we always say like this is a person who could only come up when he came up, but the way that he's reflecting these radical politics on a fairly large scale is kind of mind-boggling. I think Roger Waters is a case of that to an even more insane degree, with both the level of success and respect that he's had in the mainstream culture and frankly the radicalness of his politics.
No, absolutely. And obviously that's the perfect turning point to that. Basically the opposite of ContraPoints if you think about it. Roger Waters.
Yes.
So Roger Waters, real quick, Brian, obviously you know more about him than I do, although I have seen him live in concert, which you have not, correct?
No, I'm very jealous of you for that.
No, totally fair. And I wasn't trying to like rub it in your face. I was just trying to say just specifically that I talked to him backstage. I asked him specifically like, how you doing, bro? To be very clear, I never met him, but I did see him live on stage, and at the time a nearly 80-year-old man. He was very fit. He definitely had stage presence. He knew what the fuck he was doing, which, I gotta say, as somebody who used to work with the elderly, that's pretty goddamn impressive. I will give him credit. He is, even for somebody half his age, he still has great stage presence. But either way, so of course, talking talking about Roger Waters. So he was the bassist, correct, of Pink Floyd? Is
Yes.
that correct? One of the principal songwriters. And just in general, with him and David Gilmour were like two of some of the most consequential people of Pink Floyd.
Yes. So there was a period of time in Pink Floyd where after Sid Barrett's decline, they all wrote more or less equally, basically until, let's say, Dark Side of the Moon. Maybe a little before that, when Roger kind of... So I think he always wrote more just in his life. He had been writing poetry and things as a kid. After a few years, he kind of found kind of his muse, right? So you really see that take form on Dark Side of the Moon. But yeah, Pink Floyd, and largely the principal songwriter for their most famous, most popular, and most beloved albums. That's basically everything Pink Floyd did throughout the 70s. Every Pink Floyd song that you probably know when you think of Pink Floyd, if you're not like kind of like this huge weirdo fan of them like me, is probably a Roger Waters song. He wrote all of the lyrics on Dark Side of the Moon, the vast majority of music and all of the lyrics on The Wall, wrote all the lyrics on Animals, all the lyrics on Wish You Were Here. He's also, even on those albums that were more collaborative, right, he's basically the person that came up with the general concept. So he came up with the narrative and the flow of Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here, even though they were pretty musically collaborative. He has a very specific drive that you only really know this if you're someone like me that's really into Pink Floyd. If you're kind of just a casual fan, I think a lot of people don't think about this. He's not really very much like the other like prog songwriters, right? He's not into kind of this flowery imagery. He's not into like this fantastical kind of like imagery or this pseudo-Eastern mysticism like say Yes. He basically writes and has almost always written these really kind of bitter confessional songs about his life. Waters was born in 1944, 5 months after his birth, I believe. His father, who was in the war at the time of his birth, died.
His dad was a conscientious objector as well. That's a very important part of that story.
So Waters' father was a conscientious objector. Both of Waters' parents were British Communist Party. I believe, in fact, the Soviet-aligned party at the time. And I believe his mother stayed a member throughout her life. His father was a conscientious objector until the Blitz. During that time, he was an ambulance driver and a nursemaid. The devastation of this suffering on his home that he saw during the Blitz convinced him to take up arms and to no longer be a conscientious objector and to join what he was perceiving as a unified struggle against fascism. Pretty sensible interpretation at the time, whether you're, I guess like a Churchill type British, liberal nationalist or a quote unquote Stalinist, which is how Waters describes his father. Just a few months after signing up, his father dies. This is understandably pretty traumatic. Waters grows up without a father. His mother is a school teacher and I guess a very left-leaning person, but also kind of like a strict British school teacher, kind of strict and firm and repressive and sometimes very warm and sometimes very harsh. He goes to private school. He has a fairly bourgeois family, but basically everything you see him write about is this experience of like his feeling that he grew up in this time, his feeling that he lost his father for what was supposed to be this post-war image of the world where countries would coexist and would struggle against poverty and struggle against fascism. The feeling that that's what his father died for and that it was robbed of him when he was growing up and that instead he was raised in this rapid industrialization where like the education system exists not to, develop curiosity, but to prepare one for the workforce and spit them out. As he's a teenager and in his 20s, his solution to that is to join a rock and roll band. And he's, the perfect age to do that, being born in 44. And eventually becomes their primary songwriter and he writes the albums you all know. And the thread you see lyrically in there is kind of an obsession with the concept of empathy, the concept of like understanding other people or of not being able to understand other people when you should. And the through line you see musically is not so much that he's like musically, he's not very into guitar solos, he's not very into rocking out, he's into music as a tool for a narrative and these kind of flowing overarching stories or concepts, right? And you see those two things follow him throughout his career. And you see his politics become more and more radical over the course of the 70s and especially into the 80s under Margaret Thatcher.
Yes, and speaking of, I think that leads perfectly into, I would say, two pieces of art that he made that you recommended to me, Brian, to listen to before this episode that really encapsulated that feeling, especially of this sort of anti-Thatcherist and the anti-neoliberal feelings that he has in his artistic ventures, which is The Final Cut, Amused to Death. Yes, and I know you're going to have a lot more opinions on this, but real quick, I do want to say, I did like them both. The Final Cut to me, even though lyrically and obviously when it came to the actual themes, I could obviously identify with it a little bit more because the other one is very much about, or Amused to Death, to be very clear. Amused to Death is very much a concept album about something that I personally don't have any feelings about, or I can't identify with because what, about a monkey watching the news or something? Which, by the way, I'm not trying to say that dismissively. I think that's an interesting concept. But like, The Final Cut is definitely about specifically like anti-Thatcherism and like Roger Waters Waters very conflicted feelings about the, what was it, the Falklands War? Is that correct?
Yes, it's the Falklands War. It originally was conceived very early on as sort of a loose ends of the wall, which was the album preceding it.
And actually, on top of it, too, some songs in the final cut were actually in The Wall, the movie.
So one of the songs that's on the final cut on the CD version is When the Tigers Broke Free, which was originally only in the Pink Floyd The Wall movie. It wasn't on the original final cut vinyl, but it was intended to be. It just, I think, didn't fit when the album was reissued on CD. When the Tigers Broke Free was included.
Okay, because that was the one I listened to, so I'm glad that clarified, because I'm like, oh, I heard the song from The Wall. Okay, that makes sense.
Yep.
And to be fair, that is obviously a great classic song on the movie as well as on the album.
Like a beloved Pink Floyd song. One of two final cut songs that David Gilmour has said he is a fan of.
David Gilmour is definitely a hater of the final cut, that's for sure. I saw some interviews and he did not look very happy about the release of that album, to be honest.
Yeah. So the final cut, this is a good segue, is one of the most important albums to Roger. He still refers to it. He still plays many songs from it in his live shows. It's a very divisive album. First of all, casual Pink Floyd fans or just classic rock fans probably don't know about the final cut, even though it is an album by one of the most famous classic rock bands. But the only people that you hear talk about the final cut, that I hear talk about the final cut, are like Pink Floyd fans. And there are people who feel like it's this very cohesive, very beautiful, emotional, kind of stripped down, really moving album. And there are people who listen to it and they go, this doesn't sound like, this is just Waters talking through his drama over some minimal beats. There's no kind of Pink Floyd dynamics. There's very little David Gilmour guitar, although he does manage to scratch through to the surface on a few tracks. It's very divisive. For me, myself, I think I heard that album when I was 14 and I was a huge Pink Floyd fan. And I was specifically at the time, now I would say I'm equally a Syd Barrett fan and a Roger Waters fan, but at the time I was a Roger Waters fan. I think Roger Waters is indirectly responsible for a lot of my interests in music and maybe even in politics, because I was about 12, 13 when I became a fan of his. But there are Pink Floyd fans who look at the final cut and they go, I don't understand why this was released as Pink Floyd. And it doesn't really sound like Pink Floyd if you're thinking of Dark Side of the Moon. It flows in that sort of narrative way, but it is not a band interacting and fleshing out ideas together. It is fully composed by Roger Waters and it's very theatrical. So the songs are almost to me like chapters in a novel rather than a series of songs with melodies and keys and things.
I fully agree with that. And that's also why the other album really does very much, it flows much better as like a Roger Waters album than a Pink Floyd album. Because I listened to both those albums and like, obviously you listen to the Pink Floyd one and it is what it is. And then the Roger Waters one, you're like, no, this is definitely a Roger Waters album, but it's just called, it's under the Pink Floyd label. Because like hearing that album, I'm just like, yeah, no, I could definitely see why David Gilmour didn't like this nearly as much. Because like, and you know, once again, I'm not going to talk too much shit about David Gilmour. Like, I don't dislike him. I mean, I think his politics are fucking stupid, but at the same time, like, he's obviously a very talented musician. I will never deny that. But like,
very talking about seems like a sweet guy.
He seems like a boring liberal European. That's basically the best way I can describe him. A rich liberal European. That's the best way I can describe him.
Yeah, certainly his politics are more approachable to most people than Roger Waters, especially in the 1980s. Because Roger Waters is, Taylor, you actually said this when I brought up this earlier, he's kind of the closest thing to what you would call a tanky for someone of his generation and his level of wealth.
Roger Waters, for sure, absolutely. Like he's got to be the richest tanky in the world. Like just straight up. Like I'm not even saying that as like necessarily criticism, because of course he's been a famous musician. He's been a famous musician for well over 50 years. Of course he's going to be rich. But you know what I'm saying? Like he is somebody who's actually using his class and wealth privilege to actually advocate for good causes, which is something that basically no other rich person ever will do. Just straight up. Like even if they're trying to, they won't do that.
Things that maybe less so recently, as things like what's happening in Gaza have become easier to talk about, have become more publicized. But Waters was an advocate for things like that in the 90s and 2000s, when there was a period of time where I think it did kind of damage his career. He was always able to tour. He's the Pink Floyd guy. But there was a period of time where it was kind of a threat on his career as a solo artist to play the shows that he played, to say the things that he said.
I can tell you what, Brian, real quick. So when I saw Pink Floyd, I'm sorry, not Pink Floyd, once again, Roger Waters live, I can tell you what, there were people who were fucking pissed at that show. Like, I saw so many people walk out. I saw the people in front of us who were fucking assholes. They literally were smoking inside of a fucking sports arena, an indoor sports arena. They were fucking dickheads. Like, not even smoking weed. They were smoking cigarettes and, like, yelling, like, get off the stage, you liberal cuck, or whatever. and they were being really annoying about it. And I saw so many people boo and like leave when he was like talking about his political, not like talking about, but you know what I mean? Like in his songs, he was singing about his like opinions and stuff like that. Even then the show started off with like, this is, you know, my adaptation of The Wall in the 21st century. And like, this is, it wasn't even The Wall. I mean, there was a little bit of The Wall, but it was like his new vision of his like project. And at the end he said, you know what, I'm going to have my opinions. And if you don't like it, you can fuck off and leave. That's literally what he had as like a
fuck
sign.
Off to the bar.
Yep, that's what he said, exactly. And like, to be fair, obviously I respect that because like there's so many fans who went to that show, and not all of them, but a large chunk of those people who literally just wanted to hear Roger Waters play like fucking Dark Side of the Moon and like Wish You Were Here and like nothing else. And then they got an actual interesting show, which now I'm not saying those albums aren't interesting, but like he has a personal point of view that he wants to be out there. He doesn't want to just be a fucking tribute act. Like, just being honest, like David fucking Gilmour and
like what Pink Floyd
Nick Mason wanted to do.
Left.
And that fuck ass album that came out 5 years ago that sucked shit.
I have ups and downs with all the stages of Pink Floyd. Endless River is a fucking joke. So regarding the people calling Waters a cucked out liberal, first of all, Waters, and this is meaningless to the people that say that, as we alluded to, he is not someone that I would call a liberal. And I don't just mean that because like, oh, Democrats are liberals. His politics, he describes himself, and he always has, I think since the 70s, openly, he's said he was a socialist. He doesn't elaborate on what that means. I think he doesn't want to be put on the spot. Of course, he's a child of the Cold War, and his politics at times do come off as, and I say this as something that I have no issue with this, you might call even illiberal. He has said that he believes that liberalism, I've talked before on here about how I think liberalism leads to a sort of moral relativism that's kind of cancerous. He was on Chris Hedges' show recently, and he was on the Joe Rogan podcast about a year ago, and in both instances he said that the natural final stage of liberalism is sort of a corrosive free market. He did mean like social, like kind of DNC liberal ideals. So again, that doesn't matter to like the chuds that are just calling him a cucked liberal, but that's really not his political worldview. But also, what do you think he was writing about with Pink Floyd? Like, presumably, if you're like, whoa, I love Pink Floyd from the 70s, then you probably love The Wall. Well, The Wall is all about someone growing up in post-war Britain, going through this industrialized education process, and feeling like unable to communicate or articulate themselves to their peers, alienating themselves, and how that sort of alienation on an individual level is corrosive to your relationships, and how that sort of alienation on a mass level leads to fascism. Like, it is a very socialist album in its orientation, and it's not subtle. One thing that I would never say is that Roger Waters has ever been subtle.
No, absolutely. Yeah, you can never accuse him of being too subtle. Like, and that was also, and obviously we're not going to get into this because we covered it on a whole ass episode, but that's also another thing with, Doug Walker, the Nostalgia Critic, and his, like, The Wall review is like, it's so blatant, but it's also really vague. And it's like, no, it's actually pretty blatant what he actually fucking believes in. Like, I'm sorry, like, and I'm not saying that it's once again a positive or negative. It just is what it is. Everybody has a point of view, and not everything has to be fucking sly or detached or whatever. But like, yeah, his viewpoint is very, very clear in his music, just objectively speaking. Like, his point of view is very fucking clear. He literally once again said it at the beginning of the live show that I saw. If you don't like it, fuck off to the bar. You can't get much more clear than that. You can't be like, well, if you don't like it, then I guess you could stick around and maybe you'll agree with me later. It's not that fucking passive aggressive shit.
And he's also not like, well, let's put our differences aside, guy, which, to be clear, is, I think, when you're like a famous person talking about your position, that is how you should be. If you're trying to platform what you believe is a morally correct position, you shouldn't do this, well, we all have an opinion thing, because then you're downplaying like the moral correctness of what you believe.
Absolutely. Like, it's one of those things where, like, say what you want about Roger Waters, like, but he definitely is not part of some like fucking PR firm doing like, media training fucking shit. You know what I mean? That's definitely more of like, once again, the David Gilmour and the Nick Mason school, which, whatever.
Yeah, they
there's
did that
some
song
value.
for Ukraine.
Yeah. Oh, jeez. Well, oh boy, let's not get into Russia, Ukraine when it comes to fucking Roger Waters, because boy, there's some complicated feelings on that. But yeah.
Yeah. I think it'd be a good time to circle back to Waters' sort of his political determination, which again has been pretty unwavering since the 1960s to the present day. If anything, it's only gotten more radical. But to tie this back to, you had mentioned about the Amused to Death album, that its concept is a little strange on its face. So I want to talk a little bit about that record in particular, because I do think it offers some insight into Waters' kind of worldview and his drive post Pink Floyd. So, as you said, Taylor, The Final Cut, which was the last album that Waters was involved with under the Pink Floyd name, it's basically a Roger Waters solo album, right? It doesn't really sound like the band Pink Floyd. The lyrics are very personally Roger Waters. Musically, it's again him doing like a narrative. Amused to Death came out in 1992. It's actually his third solo album. Well, it's his third complete solo album. And it's probably his most well well loved at this point of his solo work. His first solo album, Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, is very personal, not really a political album. It is still, generally about empathy, but it's kind of about, a dissolving marriage. It's, I think, largely autobiographical, like many of his albums are. Radio Chaos was the album after that. Like Amused to Death, it has a storyline. It has kind of a general rock opera concept, but the real concept is more in like the themes and the politics of it. The actual story, what you might call a story for Amused to Death, is a chimpanzee that is hooked up, is being tested out, and is being made to watch the news of the day on television, to watch advertisements, all these things on TV. But what Amused to Death is really about, you can almost remove that story part from the album with the exception of one or two songs where it's really explicit. And what it's really a concept album about is about the end of the Cold War and kind of the end of history, which we've talked a lot about on here. What George Herbert Walker Bush referred to as a new world order, basically an order of neoliberalism. So Amused to Death is, to my reading, and I think this is consistent with everything that Waters has talked about in the decades first, is him looking out and seeing like the unfettered sprawl of like liberal capitalism infecting every corner of the world with the end of the Cold War. And it uses this sort of TV motif as a way to say like all of these things that are happening throughout the world, they're laundered to you in America and in Britain through the television. And they kind of create this disconnect as the world is kind of degenerating. Of his solo albums, this is the album that he pulls the most from when he's doing major tours. Of course, he plays a lot of Pink Floyd on his solo tours. He tries to pick a little bit from every solo album. He maybe picks one song from Radio Chaos, one from Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, but he'll often play, even to this day, 5 or 6 songs from Amused to Death. And I think it's because it's such a linear line from that album to what he's talking about right now. It seems disrespectful to call them fixations, but it spends a lot of time in the last 20 years emphasizing talking about Gaza, talking about NATO, and you can kind of see, I think, with that album, I mean, the final cut, right, would probably be the time when he said, okay, I'm making apolitical. Like, I'm now fashioning myself into not a rock star that sometimes writes about politics, which is maybe what he was through most of his time with Pink Floyd, but someone who, at least wants to be an activist, wants to take an active role in trying to improve things, and whose art will reflect that. But what's interesting is you can go all the way back, some of his very earliest songs with Pink Floyd. I think it's pretty well known. When Pink Floyd started, they're a psychedelic band, right? They're whimsical. Syd Barrett's writing most of the songs. They're whimsical and surreal and maybe a little bit dark, but Syd Barrett was not writing political songs. That's not how people tend to think about Pink Floyd, probably until the mid-70s. But one of the first songs that Roger writes with Pink Floyd is this song called Corporal Clegg, and it's very tongue-in-cheek. It's kind of sarcastic, and if you weren't really paying attention, it might even sound like another whimsical psychedelic song. It's basically like a hard rock psychedelic song. It's similar to like something that the Beatles would have done around the same time, or like the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Has all these kind of whimsical sounding visions of being rewarded by the Queen and getting medals and things. And the reality is that he is, deformed and traumatized and kind of living in his head. His wife, who now tends to him, is an alcoholic. But if you aren't really listening to that, if you're not reading the lyrics on paper, it just seems like this funny, quirky, Beatles-esque song about this wacky guy named Corporal Clegg. And as time goes by, his politics get more and more emboldened. Like, Dark Side of the Moon is pretty political when you know about Waters, when you know about kind of his interests and his themes. But if you don't know that, it just seems like kind of generally philosophical, right? With the exception of maybe a song like Us and Them, which has allusions to war and to like camps and things. Wish You Were Here, not really political, very introspective, kind of about interpersonal relationships, right? Animals is pretty obviously political. Like, it's even pretty obviously, I would say, anti-capitalist, but it uses this kind of general popular George Orwell inspired, there's 3 classes of people. There's sheep, which are workers, and there's dogs, which are kind of corporations that hedge workers along, mass media, and there's pigs, who are like the people at state who work with the dogs to kind of determine where capital leads. But if you don't really know about Waters, again, you could be a libertarian and relate to animals. You could be just a liberal, you'd probably be a Republican, and you might still think it's applying to your worldview. From the final cut onwards, I think Waters makes a conscious decision to not be misunderstood anymore. To say, like, I'm a political actor through my music. And Amused to Death, I think it's the first time he really successfully balances that sort of unabashed politics with being a rock and roll singer-songwriter. Because while I love the final cut, it's one of my favorite Pink Floyd albums, it's not exactly a rock and roll album for the most part. There aren't a lot of hooks, there aren't a lot of melodies. And as I said, his 2 solo albums before that are not as political, or they're kind of messy musically. Amused to Death is kind of Roger Waters consciously, I think, saying, I'm going to make this really bombastic, theatrical rock and roll album. Jeff Beck plays lead guitar on it. Got these amazing background singers, kind of R&B, female background singers. But the lyrics are about about the unchecked rise of neoliberalism. It's a really strange album. It's pretty beloved by Roger Waters fans. To be honest, I don't even know if I would recommend Amused to Death to just like a random Pink Floyd fan on the street if they didn't already know about it.
No, absolutely. I totally agree, especially with that last viewpoint or that last point that you had. Like, just straight up, I remember the live show that I went to years ago did have also I think, trio, if I'm not mistaken, of like female backup singers, and they definitely did sing. I don't know if it was quite any songs from this album. I'd have to look at the track list to be honest with you, but like, I vaguely remember them playing maybe a song or two off this album for that live show. I mean, I could be totally wrong. I'd have to look.
I'm sure they did. So this album and the final cut, which are, of course, those are the two that I suggested you listen to for this episode. Waters really likes to push those albums on his live shows, and I think it's because he's extremely proud of them, and he knows that for him and his progression as an artist, they're really important. And he also is aware that a lot of his casual fans aren't familiar with them. So I think he really pushes both of those albums on his stadium tours.
No, absolutely. And like, you're totally right about not recommending this to like casual, more Pink Floyd fan, because like, I can tell you what, once again, the audience at that live show, they definitely looked like they were only there to listen to the fucking Wall, Dark Side of the Moon, and Wish You Were Here, and that's pretty much about it. If I were to hazard a guess, they did not look very excited to hear some of the deeper cuts to the more surface level Pink Floyd fan. I can tell you that goddamn much.
This album and most of Waters' work until very recently, his solo work, doesn't particularly sound like his most famous work with Pink Floyd. It's concept albums, it's theatrical, but it's not really psychedelic. Like, I wouldn't call either the final cut or Amused to Death even remotely psychedelic rock.
No, not at all. Not at all. I would not describe them as psychedelic. They're definitely kind of the opposite of that, if you ask me.
They're like singer-songwriter albums, right?
Yeah, they're like singer-songwriter albums with a bit of a obvious concept to them. But yeah, calling them psychedelic, I definitely would not agree with that. This is definitely not the one album they did with fucking Syd Barrett years ago. I can tell you that goddamn much.
The thing with Waters in general, as we said before, is basically from the final cut or from Dark Side of the Moon onward, he's been doing these concepts. For a while, it's pretty collaborative. He'd have the concept, he'd have the lyrics, and he'd have kind of the narrative, and him and the rest of Pink Floyd would figure it out. And over time becomes more dominant in that. And I'm not saying this is a positive or negative. People feel both ways about it. You can see, especially after The Wall, that for Waters, the narrative and the concept take precedence a lot of time over the music. Everything he does is really interesting. I love the final cut. I love Amused to Death. I love Radio Chaos. But I understand that if you're listening to Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here, and even The Wall, which is mostly Waters' baby, which are these very cohesive albums that are still music first for the most part, right? That maybe if you listen to Amused to Death, which has these very direct lyrics, these very specific lyrics, and also Amused to Death is actually a very musical album. There's a folk song on there. There's these kind of anthemic kind of cock rock songs on there, Bravery of Being Out of Range and What God Wants. There's songs that are almost kind of like gospel songs with like these three background singers harmonizing. It's very theatrical, right? The music serves the purpose of moving the narrative and the lyrics forward, rather than, say, on Dark Side of the Moon, where clearly the music comes first and the lyrics are informed by it.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more on that. And like, just in general, like I said, I very much appreciate that Roger Waters, no matter what, no matter how much criticism he gets, he's always willing to be himself and try to get his creative vision in there more than anything else. Like, I really do respect that about him. Like, and obviously he's a rich celebrity, so I could never like hang out with him or whatever, but among the rich celebrities, I would probably tolerate being around him more than almost any, if I were to hazard a guess, especially musicians.
That's more or less how I feel. I have pretty negative opinions about their post-Roger Waters work, but even the Division Bell, I've got some love for. I think when you look at how long Waters has been doing, like, he hasn't at any point in his career taken the path of least resistance. From the time that Syd Barrett, basically, Waters, along with everyone else in Pink Floyd, went about not just trying to replicate what Syd wrote, but make some of the weirdest and most avant-garde, most kind of anti-musical albums of the late 60s and early 70s. And they keep pushing forward, keep experimenting and refining their craft until eventually they can put all these things they've learned together in Dark Side. After Dark Side, I guess they could have just churned out more albums that were like Dark Side of the Moon, but they do Animals, they do Wish You Were Here, they do The Wall, which are also huge hits, but are also like very expertly crafted and very kind of difficult albums to make. See Waters kind of move away from Pink Floyd and more towards his political ambitions. Makes it sound like he's running for office or something, but
his advocacy.
His advocacy, thank you. You see that he's expressing opinions. I mean, this isn't standard. This isn't even like the Red Wedge movement where like punk and new wave artists were like pushing for like people to vote Labor to push them left, which was a big thing, right? But this isn't even like that. This is like him expressing pretty harshly condemning the British Empire and, the legacy policy of Churchill, of Margaret Thatcher, and kind of the whole economic system, like the British banking system, which you can, if you want to say something that I think is pretty stupid and you want to call him a hypocrite for being rich while saying that, you can. But it's a pretty unpopular opinion at that time. And as I said, his politics have only gotten more radical. He hasn't softened on it. He's just over the last years become a more and more intense advocate for Gaza, an opponent of NATO expansion. Basically, just things you don't hear musicians of his level of fame and success and of his generation talk about. I don't see at this point, he's 80 now, 82. I don't see him suddenly changing his mind and telling everyone to vote for the Dems.
That would be really fucking hilarious. He has those conversion moments. He's like, oh my God, I really love Keir Starmer. And then he just dies. That would be so funny. He's like vote for Keir Starmer for leadership. And then he immediately dies on his deathbed. And obviously we're not joking about him actually dying, but that would be funny if he has some deathbed liberalism. That would be hilarious.
I told you to vote for Hillary Clinton.
I think that poor people should be means tested for food share.
So if you're interested in how far left Roger's politics are at this late date, he did an album in 2017. He did an album called Is This the Life We Really Want? It is generally agreed by Roger Waters fans to be probably his best solo album to date. It's the most like Pink Floyd he has sounded since probably The Wall, to be honest. It sounds very reminiscent of 70s Pink Floyd. It's a little funky and a little bluesy and very ominous sounding. Again, it has a lot of lyrics about drone strikes, a lot of lyrics about NATO, and of course a lot of lyrics about Donald Trump and about the failure of labor and of the Democratic Party. If you are someone who's maybe a Pink Floyd fan and you're interested, in what's Roger Waters' solo stuff about? Probably the best place to start would be his 2017 album, because it's the closest to anything he did in the 70s, but it's also his most politically strident, I would say, maybe even more so than the final cut or Amused to Death.
Yes, and also, just to clarify, the tour that he did was This Is Not a Drill, which was is considered by him to be one of his farewell tours. So he might be ending his live tours very soon, but I did get to see him. I think it was the 10th or 11th date on the tour. So it was pretty early in the actual tour because there were apparently 99 dates, which once again, this was a man who was nearing 80 years old who did 99 shows in the span of about 5 or 6 months.
Fucking Morrissey is 60 and he cancels 2/3 of the shows he books.
Well, that's the thing. Everybody's talking about he's canceled. He's like, well, you think I'm theoretically canceled? I'm going to cancel myself.
I'll show you. I got to echo kind of what you said at the beginning from when you saw that this is not a drill tour. Waters is doing not just playing the hits, he's doing new arrangements. He's also recontextualizing all these different songs from throughout his career to fit into a specific message that is relevant to what's happening right now. In preparation for this earlier this week, I watched the This Is Not a Drill, the concert film, and I'm going to say it's one of the best things he's ever done. It really is. He's found a way to kind of reconcile that really ambitious, musically driven, anthemic Pink Floyd thing with, the unflinching politics of his solo career. He's really pulls it off. I kind of like that Dark Side of the Moon Redux album he did. I thought it was kind of nice.
Which apparently is a very nuclear take, because I saw a list of recent Rate Your Music listings, and that was considered one of the worst albums of all time on that website, which I'm going to be honest, there's no way that's true. I'm just going to be honest. There's no fucking way it's that bad. For the one song I listened to that they use as an example, it didn't sound that bad. I mean, come the fuck on. Broken Side exists, okay? Blood on the Dance Floor exists. Onision exists. Come on.
I have a theory about why that album was so reviled.
Real quick, Brian, I honestly think I would not be surprised if it's Lib's still mad about, and I know we're not going to get into it because the whole can of worms, but his Ukraine and Gaza and Palestine stuff. I would not be surprised if there's fucking Zionists and Hasbaris and Ukraine dick lickers who just want to just review bomb anything to do with Roger Waters. There was a concerted anti-Semitism fucking what they did with Corbyn to him a few years ago, and thankfully he didn't take the bait like Corbyn did, but they were trying pretty hard for a few months there, straight up.
Yeah, so I think that's an element, but what I really think it is so there is a large contingency of people, including people who would probably are pretty well acquainted with Pink Floyd's most popular works, who would call them one of their favorite bands. So Pink Floyd aren't the type of band that you just know all the members. They're not the Beatles, right? They didn't really do music videos. They weren't really image conscious. Most of the aesthetics were kind of abstract and not focused on the band members. There's a lot of people who had no idea that Roger Waters had solo albums. And then they saw the guy from Pink Floyd did remakes of The Dark Side of the Moon. First of all, when people see that he did a redux of Dark Side of the Moon, for some reason people assume that that's intended to replace the original album. That's the same as when a band covers another band and they go, well, why would they do that? The original is already good. It's that's not why you remake something. It's to reinterpret it and to say something new with it, right? The other thing is that what he's doing is not to replace the original Dark Side of the Moon, and it's to reflect kind of what he's doing musically now. So it's very stripped down. It's mostly acoustic. He's very influenced by like Neil Young and by John Lennon solo work. It's rearrangements. I think it was largely done. Well, first of all, it was done because of his 80th birthday. Like that's why he did that. So it's him revisiting the Dark Side of the Moon, this thing that he wrote that changed his life, as he reflects on his mortality. That is very clearly the context of that Dark Side of the Moon redux. It is not intended as like, I'm Roger Waters and I could do Dark Side of the Moon now better without the band, which is how a lot of people interpreted it. By the way, he's never said anything like that about his bandmates. As much as people that don't like Waters like to say that he thinks he did everything, he's very fair to every other member of that band. He speaks very highly of all of them in a very professional, non-friendly, but very genuine way. The point of that album is for him to say, this is the album that changed my life, that catapulted me to the stratosphere, that I never thought I'd do, that kind of raised all these questions within me. 80 years old, how do I feel about this now? What do these songs mean now? And they're not the same. They're different songs to him now. That's the point of that album. I understand, like, if you're a classic rock guy and you like Dark Side of the Moon because it kicks ass, which it does. It's beautiful. It's got these great guitar solos. Rick Wright and David Gilmour do these beautiful harmonies. All the songs flow together. And you're comparing this redux to that, you're not going to like it. But that's not what this is. It's almost like a deconstruction of Dark Side of the Moon to me. And I think it's almost like, so we, Taylor, have said basically that people made fun of Lulu because they were kind of normies, right? Lulu's not a great album. It's a mess, but like, it's not so weird and so bad.
Well, especially when it came to the, last album. For that being the last album of Lou Reed, that is a fucking great final album for somebody like Lou Reed. Like,
and it's very Lou Reed.
People who have made far worse albums of their last album. Like, I'm not going to say it's quite, David Bowie, like, Dark Star level, like, quality for a final album, right. But, like, it's a pretty good fucking final album for that.
But the thing is, a bunch of people that probably don't even listen that much Metallica, but listen mostly to, like, Radio Metallica, to Load and Unload and Black Album, and probably have never listened to anything by Lou Reed, they hear that album and they're like, this guy's not even singing, he's just talking. Which, like, yeah, if you ever listen to Lou Reed, that's what he does. And then they go, this is terrible, this is a joke. If you're someone that's listened to Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, and you've listened to Amused to Death, and you kind of know Waters' trajectory and the story that he's telling through his work. Like, okay, on the Dark Side of the Moon Redux, he makes allusions to pre-Dark Side of the Moon, like Pink Floyd deep cuts he wrote, that you would only know if you're a big Pink Floyd fan, because he understands them as being important to, like, his growth as an artist. So he references, like, the song Free 4, which is a song that you only know if you're a big Pink Floyd fan. But if you're just like, I like Dark Side of the Moon, I like The Wall, oh, he did new recordings of Dark Side of the Moon. And if you're, like, kind of a casual fan and you just like those albums, you're expecting this big, lush, oh, he probably did it really beautiful and really modern. And they don't. They sound very stark. They sound mostly acoustic. They sound very cold. And they sound, to be honest, a little bitter. Because I think where Waters is at as he reaches the stage of his life is he's thinking, I've been singing about the same things for 50, 60 years now. I've spent my whole life reflecting on how my dad died for this thing that never came to pass. And, basically was stolen out from under us. I've spent my whole adult life kind of writing about these things and thinking about these things, and they just keep getting worse. And so I think that's what is on his mind when he revisits Dark Side of the Moon, which is a rather dark album, but also a pretty warm album, right? Dark Side of the Moon is ultimately all about how we're, to put it in the corniest way, right? That album is about how we're all in it together, right? You look at Money, you look at Us and Them, you look at Breathe. Those are songs about how we all share a humanity and we need to see each other as humans. So he's revisiting that song and feeling, a little burnt out and going, Anyway, that's my feelings on the Dark Side Redux.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And, Brian, speaking of reflecting on things that have long since passed, we have now been recording for quite a while now. Do we have any final thoughts before we get to the pluggables, or anything you want to talk about before we get to our pluggables?
If you're into rock and roll music, you should listen to some Pink Floyd, particularly stuff that Roger Waters wrote. If you haven't listened to him, you should listen to The Wall and Dark Side of the Moon. But if you are stuck in this thing where you're not sure if you can identify with, like, dad rock or whatever, which is also kind of a loaded term, don't really like it, or like boomer rock, I think it would be worthwhile to think about, the stuff that Roger Waters was writing. There's very few people like him of his era, pretty based, ethically, morally, politically, also just like musically very uncompromising. And if you're looking for something that's like classic rock, very anthemic, big guitars, very theatrical, but has like really thoughtful, really thought-provoking political lyrics, maybe you're into Queen, but you don't want to hear the corny bicycle lyrics, right? Or you're into Rush, but you don't want to hear about the trees. Maybe you should listen to Amused to Death. Maybe you should listen to Is This What We Really Want? Because it's pretty interesting to hear a guy of Waters' generation saying some of the stuff he's saying. Obviously, those people existed. There were a lot of them, and they did a lot of great work, but you don't see them represented in classic rock a whole lot.
No, absolutely. And, my final thoughts in general. Like, obviously, I'm not as much of a, Pink Floyd and Roger Waters aficionado as Brian, but like over the years, I've very much come to appreciate both things equally. Like, I have talked and alluded to David Gilmour being kind of spineless and being a bit of a coward when it comes to his political opinions, but that's neither here nor there. Obviously, his contributions to Pink Floyd are just as valuable as Roger Waters. Obviously, all four of the, mainstay members, and of course, once again, rest in peace, Sid Barrett. You definitely made, I mean, honestly, one of the best psychedelic albums fucking ever. His solo efforts are also fucking incredible. I mean, genuinely a tragic loss to both the world and the greater artistic community of his passing. But like over the years, I've definitely learned to appreciate Pink Floyd more and more, and definitely Roger Waters more and more. And like I said, I have always respected Roger Waters' commitment to his politics, which I generally would say I agree with probably a good 90% of his politics. Like, and that's on the low end, a good 90% of his politics.
Same.
And like, he's somebody who, once again, has always had an unwavering, unflattering vision. And thankfully, he has been able to, have that vision be, portrayed into his art, which is great. But at the same time, like I said, I'm just so glad that he's able to just be who he is and be unapologetically. And no matter what, even with, some of his bandmates, not necessarily like actively criticizing him, obviously, because I think they've been relatively cordial, all considered. But either way, like from people like his old bandmates to anti-Semitism grifters out there and just sort of general like shit libs trying to destroy his reputation. The fact that he is
about David
somebody...
Gilmour's wife calling him a bitter old anti-Semitic and a cancerous old man, right?
I do know about that, and once again, David Gilmour, I'm sure she gives you a lot of fun times at home, but man, that sucks for you, bro. And who knows, maybe he's even worse in private. Who the fuck knows? But, it's just one of those things where, once again, he has always been somebody who's been very unflattering in his viewpoints, and he's somebody who always, as the kids say, stands on business, and I just have to respect that no matter what. And I've always liked what he's done. Like I said, his live show was fantastic. I enjoyed the whole, 2.5 hour experience, and, after the show, he said go to the stands after the fucking show because he was at the time advocating for Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. That was his stance along with his merch. And he was saying half of the merch sales will go to Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, which what big fucking rock star of a legacy band from the 70s and 60s and 80s does shit like that? They wouldn't dream of doing, even if they agreed with it, they would not dream of doing something like that. Roger Waters will go on fucking Abby Martin, not going Abby Martin's show or whatever, or some random person with 10,000 subscribers who's pro-Palestine. But Roger Waters will do that because he genuinely gives a shit. You know what I mean? He fucking cares. He wants to see the world be a better place. And for somebody who's worth, well into the 9 figures, that's very admirable.
Not really anyone else like him, artistically or politically, of his generation. Or now, really.
No, absolutely. But yeah, so that is our episode on Roger Waters, and this will definitely not be the last time we talk about Roger Waters and Pink Floyd, because it will certainly be woven into many of the other subjects we will talk about on further episodes. But for right now, I think that will be the end of our discussion. So, Brian, let's get into our pluggables. So you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com. And as well, please subscribe and follow us on both our YouTube and our Spotify channel, where we are uploading every episode simultaneously to both platforms. And as well, I have been starting a personal finance YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram channel. Now, I don't have any content in that area at the moment, on those accounts at the moment. But at the same time, feel free to follow and subscribe to me on those accounts, because I eventually will make content for it. As we've been talking about on several episodes now, we will teach Brian to not only buy a Bugatti, but also drive a Bugatti, and also teach him how to drive. That'll be part of the personal finance aspect.
Imagine having that as a pledge tier for our Patreon.
We'll teach you how to buy a Bugatti, which is going to a Bugatti dealership and being here's the money.
If we reach a certain tier of money, you will teach me how to drive, which I've been resistant to my entire life.
Oh, absolutely. Because there is no we. There is no we. It's my money. It's all my money. No, I'm kidding. I won't do that bit from Breaking Bad. But either way, if I make $1,000 a month for my personal finance YouTube channel on Patreon, I will absolutely, couple times a year fly to Brian's area in Portland, and I will 100% teach him how to drive a Bugatti. I will rent a Bugatti for the day, and we will teach him how to drive it. It'll be like Stavi getting fit, where there's some episodes where you do better, and then some episodes where you crash into a wall with it or something.
Exactly. And then if Taylor gets to 10,000, a tier of $10,000 per month, then I will watch Breaking Bad.
He will watch the best prestige TV show of all time. That is the $10,000.
Over the course of 10 years, as I feel like it.
Oh, Jesus. If we make $100,000, he will watch all of Better Call Saul. But to be fair, though, Brian, I think you would genuinely
Probably.
love Better Call Saul because it's just straight up, and I
Yeah.
know I mentioned this to you in the chat. Like just straight up, it is straight up like every episode has like one or two fucking Mr. Show bits that like I am shocked, or I would be shocked if Bob Odenkirk had nothing to do with the writing of that because I'm like, that is so Bob Odenkirk. Like the Chicago sunroof story is something that would be in like a Mr. Show episode as like a non sequitur because it's just
Yeah.
so random and it doesn't, not that it doesn't need to be there, but it's so funny because in the scene it just doesn't make any sense why it's in the scene and it's so funny. Like it's a very funny show. And I told you earlier today, I think the second to last episode of season 1, a character calls Mike Billy Jackoff. So it's very clearly a Billy Jack reference.
I had a moment reflecting on my own potential hypocrisy because I always say I don't watch prestige TV. I hate prestige TV. I don't have the attention span for it. I just can't do it. But like I've been rewatching all of the serialized comedy shows from the 2000s. I watched Moral Orel twice in March. And then I was like, oh, maybe I can watch serialized shows and I just don't watch dramas because I'm like being adamant about it. Because like, you know, like I said, clearly I have the capacity to watch a serialized program like that.
No, and it's one of those things where, we all get to where we get with our, media consumption on a level, you know what I mean? Like, I could tell you what, 10 years ago, I probably would have been like, I don't know, I'll get to Breaking Bad eventually. But now I'm like fucking obsessed with it and it's extended universe, you know what the fuck I mean? Like, we all have different stages in the things that we watch and enjoy.
Right.
Or very much so. Like, our media consumption very much changes. Like, I can tell you what, when I was a 16-year-old new metal kid, I wouldn't have given a shit what Roger Waters made.
That never would have been true for me because, so here's a real thing. I wasn't going to say it in the main beat of the episode, but maybe I just will. I am pretty sure that Roger Waters was the first person that I ever like heard self-describe as a socialist when I was like 12, and I was like, huh, that's interesting.
It's certainly fucking possible. But speaking of people who do socialist-leaning things, I do want to be very clear, this personal finance channel that I will eventually make content for, it will not be reactionary, which is 99% of personal finance content on
If you
the
know
internet.
anything about personal finance content, that's huge.
Oh, absolutely. And obviously, we're not going to delve deep into this topic, but there's been a bit of a discourse on everybody's favorite bird website where fucking, I think Kevin O'Leary was like, people make $70,000 a year spending $28 on lunch, which
he's such a fucking bitch.
He is a fucking bitch, but I will say there is something to be said about that being true. I'm not gonna lie.
No,
like,
but
don't get me wrong. I want to be clear. That is not ruining your life. I want to be very clear. That specifically, if that enriches your life, you are not a piece of shit for doing that. But there is something to be said about, instead of spending $28 on lunch, maybe spending $5 on lunch and making your own high quality lunch. That will not only make you feel better, but will also make your wallet a little fuller.
I saw people saying, it's a real take I saw, and I don't argue with people online. There's a type of person that's generally a millennial who talks about things that they consider anarchist or socialist. What it really just means is people who are like this are going to hear me and think I'm being like a chud Republican, who just think that means I should just get whatever I want. And I saw more than one person reply to that earlier tweet and say, well, that's not realistic because the average price of a fast food meal is $30 and that costs more than buying groceries. And I'm sorry, but that's not true. If you want to say fuck you, Kevin O'Leary, to sit there on your fucking mount of fucking shitty fake gold toilets and talk to me like that, you fucking dumb piece of shit, that's one thing. But like, I saw multiple people say, I have to spend $30 a day on lunch for work. That's the most affordable meal there is in this economy. And it's like,
no, it's fucking
nice try.
Like, not only buy a protein bar, make a fucking lunch sandwich.
It sucks. Yeah, that's the thing, is like, fuck that guy. But I had that same, I was seeing people get mad about that tweet. And the thing is, there are reasons to get mad at Kevin O'Leary for saying that. But it's not, this is the default was like, I have to spend that much on lunch every day because what else am I supposed to do? And it's like, go to the store.
Just go to the fucking store. It's not that complicated. And I want to be clear once again with the personal finance thing. That is not the reason that your finances suck. But I'm just saying, just like with
that wouldn't hurt.
Reasonable. Exactly. But with the reasonable advice, right? Everybody online's like, oh, you could spend $30 and as long as I'm grinding or whatever, it doesn't matter because I saved all that time cooking. Or like someone be like, well, you can only spend 50 cents on lunch because it's all you deserve until you do better. That is not what I'm saying. I want to be very practical with my advice. So stuff like that, once again, spending instead of $30 for lunch one day, spend $5 and make yourself a nice home-cooked meal. Make yourself a sandwich with artisanal bread and maybe get yourself a can of soda and like a bag of chips or something. That's reasonably healthy. It's reasonably filling. And instead of $30, it's $4 or $5. We're not asking for much here. And if that makes you feel a little bit better throughout the day, that's all that fucking matters. That is the kind of practical advice. Yeah. That kind of practical advice. And that's very minute piece of financial advice I can just give you for free without even making any content. But I will certainly delve more into that on my YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok accounts. So once again, please follow those. And talk about people who once again need our moral and financial support. The Lucifer and the Father campaign. Of course, our good good friend Scott, Shaw, and Robert are creating a fantastic series. We just had Scott on a few weeks ago. I'm just working on editing that episode as of like yesterday. And I can tell you what, I will certainly get into it maybe on a deeper episode on a bit of a editor's note, but holy shit, I had some issues getting that episode found on one of my old SSDs.
I felt so bad.
My computer fucking crashed about 3 days ago, and I had to save it, and I thought it was lost forever, and it was a disaster. But thankfully, I was able to get it. But it was a 12-hour project trying to get this episode on an old SSD that I'm probably gonna have to throw away. But thankfully, I was able to save it, and we no longer have any lost episodes of this podcast. So it's very good to hear, and I will take great care in editing that episode.
And it would have ended up being the one that Scott was on. That would have taken the longest for us to arrange to do again.
Oh, absolutely. No, it would have been a total disaster, but I'm so glad that I was able to save it. But, of course, once again, they've been great friends of ours. Scott's been on the podcast, I think now 4 times combined, if I'm not mistaken. Like, he's very much a great supporter of ours. Sean and Robert are obviously just as good of friends of ours. They're creating this great series called Lucifer and the Father. Last time I checked, they're about, I think, most of the way or a big chunk of the way through their post-production budget fundraising, but they still need more of our moral financial support to continue to get that series off the ground. And, as we always say just as well with every episode, that if you donate to their crowdfund, just send us an email, send us a YouTube comment, just showing us you donated. We will, within good reason, about 10, 15, 20 bucks, match those donations because we want Scott, Shaw, and Robert's dreams to become a reality because they're just cool guys. They're just really cool guys. Would you agree with that, Brian?
Yeah, they're great friends to the show. As we said last week, we just had Scott on. He's always a joy to have. He always gives a really unique perspective that is singular and is insightful but different from Taylor's and I's. We always complain about how there is no middle class of filmmakers, no middle class of musicians, no middle class of art anymore. Everything is either super underground or it's like this huge fucking Marvel slump. And we talk about how hard it is to be an independent filmmaker and make something outside of the big system and make something ambitious and big. And that's what Sean and Scott are trying to do with Lucifer and the Father. And again, that in addition being great friends of ours, we want to help out. Anything you can do to help them out, if you can tell them that we sent you, we would love to match that because they are working really hard to make this really cool show a reality and they've been really good to us.
No, absolutely. And speaking of people who we need to be good to, Luigi Mangione. Of course, Luigi is fighting the good fight. A few weeks ago, I believe, as of recording, it might have been a week or 2 ago, I can't remember, but a huge development in the case just dropped where a lot of the physical evidence that was obtained at the Altoona arrest is not going to be admissible in court. Great news, but of course, once again, Luigi is facing an uphill battle because he is facing 2 different state governments and the federal government. Now, of course, as we've always talked about, Luigi didn't do it. There's no compelling evidence that he did it. They're framing him because they felt embarrassed. They couldn't find the actual guy who did it. So they found somebody who vaguely looked like him and picked him up in Altoona, a man who was going through a bit of a mental health crisis at the time, also to be very clear. So they're picking out somebody who is having their struggles and they're like, well, he's being fucking weird in a McDonald's. Let's fucking track him down and let's harass him. Like, genuinely speaking, they are framing an innocent man. And we need to be there just to support him. And, if you can't support him financially, that's totally fine. Just send him a letter. If you want to have some correspondence with him, totally fine. Or also, as we've said on previous episodes before, if you have nothing nice to say, just don't say anything at all because we don't need more fucking criticism here. And, even though Luigi was picked up technically at the tail end of the Biden administration, Trump is very much continuing on that footstep of persecuting an innocent man. And we are obviously against that in every single capacity. And the Trump administration is doing that now with fucking Hassan Piker, who is somebody who also, of course, has a lot of money and influence. There's a reason why they're attacking both Luigi and Hassan, because even though, once again, Luigi didn't do it, we want to be very clear here, but they see Luigi as somebody who is a tulpa of potentially revolutionary change in the same way that Hassan, in his own very much left liberal way, is doing that. And they're attacking him specifically for that reason. And what Hassan and Luigi represent ultimately to the power structures.
No, this is a bullshit trial. As Taylor said, they picked up a random guy that vaguely looked like this person in this fucking slop security footage. Doesn't even really look like him. And yeah, they want to make an example of him. They see that nobody was particularly broken up about a fucking healthcare CEO fucking getting got, and that makes them mad. It makes them mad to see the winds turning another way that is not in their fucking favor for them to continue being fucking demons and ghouls. So they want to make an example of anyone that could even symbolize that sort of unity and that solidarity. So you gotta stand by Luigi. Again, they are absolutely innocent beyond a reasonable doubt. Also, look at the things these people, the ruling class, put you through, the indignities they put us all through in our own country and across the world every day. And you look at Luigi and you want to see them grind this guy down with nothing, with no evidence, because that's why they want to do it. They want to do it to show you that they can do it. That's why it's so important to stand by him. And yeah, Hassan. I've had criticism of Hassan. I'm sure Taylor has too. But yeah, this is in a different way, in a very different way. Anyone that stands as kind of a beacon of this turning tide, they're going to try to grind down underneath their heel. And they want you to know it.
No, absolutely. So we just need to be there for Luigi. And, Brian and I both donated to the crowdfund, but if you want to donate to the now official Luigi Mangione Defense Fund, just send us a YouTube comment, send us an email, and just showing us you donated, and within good reason, about, once again, 10, 15, $20, we will match those donations because we want Luigi's dreams of freedom to be a reality. And speaking of people whose dreams and visions of freedom need to be a reality, of course, we have a Patreon page. Now, at the moment, you don't have any patrons, but become a patron of ours today. As we always say, the first 48 hours are the most important, and our $5 tier is you get every episode 48 hours early. If you're talking to your normie coworker who just fucking loves David Gilmour, loved that one song they had on the Endless River where they used the word diss, they used AAVE to seem cool or whatever, and he thought that was the best Pink Floyd song, you could be like, no, that's not true. Actually, literally the most critically acclaimed Pink Floyd stuff was either directly inspired by Roger Waters' experiences and written by him, or was at least, heavily influenced by him instrumentally as well as lyrically. And they'd be like, no, man, I just really love the fact that Roger Waters was owned by David Gilmour's wife. I think that's really fucking cool. And you'd be like, wait, last week you were telling me Skylar was a bitch and she needs to suck like my dick or whatever. What the fuck? Like now you're all woke about women? And you'll be like, yeah, I'm just the contrarian fucking normie coworker. And you're like, okay. But still listen to this guy's podcast because these guys are really cool and they have great opinions.
Yeah, you could be listening to this show 48 hours early and you could come in and you could be the first person in your workplace to tell everyone about Roger Waters. You tell everyone about his political opinions. If you're a contrarian asshole, if you've got like a hot couch guy coworker, be like, hey, this guy, he's like the Eminem of the 70s. He's bipolar and volatile, but just generally self-righteous and indignant, and pull him on in. And we could help you get there, but you got to donate to the Patreon. Because right now you're listening to the podcast 48 hours late, and that's not going to help you. All of your coworkers have heard it by now.
No, absolutely. And then, Brian, do you have any pluggables as well?
As always, follow the podcast at Millennials Are Old Pod on Instagram and Threads. That remains the best way to contact me regarding the show. If you want to give us feedback or recommend something, a subject, if you have an idea for a cringe millennial, cringe generational subject, if you want to do a Gamergate on us or own us, Millennials Are Old Pod on Instagram and Threads. Additionally, you can follow us on the Facebook page, Millennials Are Old. That one is 3 words. Pretty much as good a way to contact me regarding the show. Millennials Are Old Pod, Instagram, Threads, probably just a little bit more consistent. Gets to my phone just a little bit quicker. Additionally, you can follow me personally on Instagram or Threads at JLoBiafra. I do have some stuff that I'm working on, some just text-based stuff. I'm going to be starting a Substack soon. Once I have it all set to go, I'll probably start plugging that here if I feel good about it, or I might just burn it down. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, Millennials Are Old Pod, Instagram and Threads, or Millennials Are Old 3-word Facebook page remain the best ways to reach out.
Heck yeah, absolutely. And speaking of people who really, just need to reach out and, swim on the dark side of the moon, and I wish you were here, Brian, because I really miss you, man, but I'm hitting a bit of an emotional wall right now. So I need to go to fucking sleep. I need to get my beauty sleep. And I think that'll get us ready to record again very soon. Would you agree with that, Brian?
Yeah, I have to dive into the shadows of my mind, deep beneath the landmines and the barking dogs, fall into the darkness of very comfortable and loving sleep.
Exactly. Recording this very much amused me to death. So have a good night, everybody. Sleep tight. We'll come back with a great episode for you next time, as always.